The prairie sky burned red at dusk, a streak of fire slashing across the horizon, like the world itself had been wounded. Wind dragged dust over the brittle grass, carrying the dry smell of earth about to break. Jed Colton rode slowly, his thin frame bent forward in the saddle. Years of ranch work and loneliness had carved lines into his face, leaving him older than his true age. Each creak of the leather sounded louder than it should, like the land itself was whispering a warning. He guided his tired horse toward the weather-worn gate that marked the edge of his small, forgotten ranch. That was when he froze. A shape swayed in the dying light. A body, a woman, massive, broad-shouldered, hung from a thick rope tied to his gatepost. Her boots scraped the wood with each gust of wind. The rope creaked. Flies buzzed around the dark stains on her hands. Jed's chest tightened. His heart slammed against his ribs. The words carved into the post stabbed deeper than any knife. This is what happens to those who defy Cain's law. He wanted to turn away, to ride back into the fading sun, but then the light shifted. For just a breath her eyelids fluttered. A rasp of air slipped from her throat. She was alive. Jed's stomach dropped. His hands shook as he pulled the knife from his belt. One stroke could free her or condemn him. The rope strained under the blade. In that moment, Jed knew his quiet life was over. The question was no longer whether to act, but what storm would come crashing down once he did. Jed's knife slashed through the rope with a snap that echoed louder than thunder in his ears. The weight of the woman fell like a tree onto his frail body, knocking the air from his chest. He staggered knees, nearly buckling beneath her massive frame. Her head lolled, her bruised neck purple and swollen, but her chest lifted with a ragged gasp. For a moment he could only stare, trembling, clutching her shoulders, as if unsure whether he had just saved her or unleashed something beyond his strength. Her skin was cold as river stone, her pulse faint but stubborn. Behind him the prairie wind moaned through the posts, dragging dust around his boots like a shroud. Jed swallowed hard, forcing down the terror clawing at his ribs. "Lord help me," he whispered, and heaved her upright. His wiry arms strained, bones creaking, but instinct pushed him forward. Step by step, dragging her weight against his brittle frame, he hauled her through the sagging gate toward the cabin. Each creak of the porch felt like a warning that both man and woman might crash straight through the rotten boards. Inside, the little house felt smaller than it ever had. Shadows stretched across the cracked floorboards, lit only by the dull glow of embers in the stove. Jed lowered her onto the narrow bed that had been empty for years, the blankets stiff from disuse. For a long breath he simply stood there, chest heaving, staring at the giant figure sprawled across his sheets. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen. Her arms were thick as fence posts, corded with muscle beneath torn fabric. Her hands, scarred and stained, looked as if they had hammered iron or lifted stone. Rope burns ringed her throat, raw and red, the mark of death, still etched deep. Her chest rose in uneven rhythm, but each breath rattled like a saw dragged through wood. Jed reached for a pitcher, poured water into a chipped mug, and pressed it to her lips. At first it spilled across her chin, soaking the collar of her shirt. Then slowly her throat convulsed, swallowing. Her eyes fluttered but did not open. His hand trembled so badly the cup nearly slipped. He set it down and stepped back, heart pounding. He should have felt relief. Instead, a chill crawled over his spine. Who was she? Why had Cain of all men chosen to make her death a spectacle at his gate? He turned to the stove, tossing in wood until flames licked high, filling the room with light. But the fire only deepened the strangeness of her presence. Her body glowed like bronze under the flicker, every scar, every bruise thrown into sharp relief. She looked less like a victim rescued from death, and more like some ancient warrior resting between battles. Jed sat down against the wall, pulling his knees to his chest, revolver resting across his lap. The house creaked with the wind outside. His mind swirled with 1,000 warnings. Leave her, drag her back to the gate. Let Cain's men find her and finish the job. But beneath the fear was something sharper, something he could not ignore. A pull, as if cutting that rope had tethered his own life to hers. The minutes stretched into hours. Every sound was louder than it should have been. The ticking of the stove, the rasp of her breathing, the distant cry of a coyote in the valley. Jed rubbed his tired eyes, fighting the urge to nod off, until a sudden movement jolted him upright. Her hand twitched. Fingers curled slightly, then dropped limp again. Jed's breath caught. He gripped his revolver tighter, sweat beading his forehead. He had seen men die before, out on the prairie, in bar fights, in winter storms, but never had he seen someone dragged back from the brink like this. The firelight cast her shadow huge and monstrous against the wall. Jed's heart hammered as he whispered to himself, "What have I done?" Outside, a sharp bang rattled the window, just a loose shutter in the wind. But Jed leapt to his feet, revolver raised, chest pounding. He waited, every nerve stretched thin. But the night remained still. When he turned back, her head had shifted on the pillow. Her lips parted in a faint, broken moan. Jed crept closer, revolver still in hand. He stared down at her face, bruised but strangely calm in sleep. He thought of the words carved into the post. "This is what happens to those who defy Cain's law." She had defied Cain and lived. For now, that thought rooted itself deep inside him. At last, he lowered the revolver, setting it on the table beside the bed. His hand lingered on the weapon's grip, but then slid away, fingers brushing instead against the edge of the rope burn, still visible, on her neck. The sight made his chest tighten with something he hadn't felt in years, a flicker of rage. He had been called weak his whole life, too frail to matter, too quiet to stand tall. But tonight, for the first time, he had cut a noose. And that meant something. Her chest lifted again, steadier now, the rise and fall sinking with the rhythm of the flames. Jed leaned back against the chair, exhaustion pressing heavy on his eyelids. Yet even as fatigue pulled him under, his gaze never left her. He knew with absolute certainty that whatever storm followed, he had crossed a line he could never retreat from. Out in the dark prairie, the wind howled like wolves circling the cabin. The little house shuddered with each gust, but inside, two souls breathed the same air: the frail rancher who had dared to cut a rope, and the giant woman who had defied the gallows. And between them, in that fragile, flickering light, the bond of survival had already begun to take root. By dawn, the fire in the stove had burned down to a soft orange glow. Mara's breathing had steadied, still rough, but no longer rattling like a saw through wood. Jed sat slumped in a chair, his revolver loose in his hand, head nodding from exhaustion. When the first gray light slipped through the cracks in the shutters, the silence broke with the sound of voices outside. Whispers. Jed froze. He pushed himself up, joints aching, and crept to the door. Through a gap in the wood, he saw them, neighbors, two women, clutching shawls tight against the chill. A pair of men with arms crossed, faces drawn tight with suspicion. They stood by the fence line, pointing toward the cabin. He brought her inside. Foolish old Colton. Weak as a calf. She should have stayed hanging. That's what Cain wanted. Jed's throat dried. He pressed his back to the door, as if his thin body could block their judgment. Behind him, the bed groaned. Mara shifted, one heavy arm falling across the blanket. The sound seemed loud enough to shake the rafters. Jed turned, pulse racing. Her eyes had not yet opened, but the mere presence of her was enough to make the room feel too small, too heavy. The whispers outside grew sharper, carried by the wind. A woman that size, still alive after the rope, unnatural. "She's cursed. He'll bring Cain's wrath on all of us." Jed's stomach twisted. He had heard their voices before, at the saloon, at the market, mocking his crooked back, his thin frame, his silence. Now those same voices cut deeper, not only at him, but at the woman he had dragged from death. He gritted his teeth, but shame burned hot in his chest. They were right about one thing: Cain would not let this go. The door rattled suddenly. A fist struck the wood. Jed flinched, nearly dropping the revolver. "Colton," a man barked. "Hand her over before Cain rides out here himself. You think you can protect her. You can't even protect yourself." Jed swallowed hard, sweat prickling down his spine. He stepped forward, blocking the doorway with his thin frame. "She's hurt," he muttered through the wood. "Leave us be." Laughter answered him, harsh and cruel. "Us? So it's true you're sheltering that monster." Behind him, the bed creaked again. This time, Jed turned and met Mara's eyes. They had opened at last. Even clouded by exhaustion, her gaze was sharp as steel, unblinking. For a heartbeat, Jed forgot the crowd outside. He felt pinned to the floor by that look, as if she could see straight through his thin body, to the fear quivering inside. Then she spoke, her voice low, gravelly but steady. "They fear me." Jed's mouth worked, but no words came. He looked away, ashamed, because she was right. Fear hung in the air like smoke, not only outside but in his own chest. The knock at the door came again, harder this time. "Open up, Colton Kane's law is clear. Harboring her makes you guilty too." Jed tightened his grip on the revolver. His hand shook so badly, the barrel wavered. He thought of Kane, white hat in church blood on his hands everywhere else. Jed had never dared to stand against him. He wasn't built for fighting. He was built for silence, for bending, for being ignored. But when he turned back to Mara, she was sitting upright, shoulders broad as the cabin wall itself. The rope burn on her neck glowed angry red in the firelight. But her posture was unyielding. She did not look like a victim. She looked like someone who had crawled back from the grave, carrying secrets too dangerous to bury. Jed's chest tightened. The murmurs outside swelled, a storm pressing against the walls. "Colton's lost his mind. He'll bring ruin on us all. Better to burn the cabin down with both of them inside." Jed's knees weakened. He pressed his back to the door, his frail frame trembling under the weight of their judgment. Every insult from his past, too skinny, too quiet, too useless, crashed down at once. They weren't just condemning her, they were condemning him, and yet Mara did not flinch. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with those steady eyes. "Let them talk," she said. "Words can't kill, not like Kane can." Her voice was a blade cutting through the haze of fear. Jed stared at her, breath shallow. He realized then that while the town saw a monster, he saw something else, a fire, dangerous and terrifying but alive. The shouts outside grew louder, footsteps crunching on the dirt. Someone hurled a stone at the fence, the crack echoing like a gunshot. Jed jerked in place, heart hammering. His finger brushed the revolver's trigger, and then silence. The crowd began to disperse, muttering curses, spitting in the dust. Kane's name hung in the air like a curse. Jed knew what it meant. The mayor hadn't come yet, but he would. When the yard emptied, Jed sagged against the door, his body shaking. He turned back toward the bed. Mara still sat upright, her eyes locked on him, unblinking, unreadable. "What have you done to me?" Jed whispered, voice cracking. Mara tilted her head, the faintest hint of a smirk tugging at her bruised lips. "Nothing you didn't choose yourself." Her words struck him harder than any insult outside. Because she was right. He had chosen. He had cut the rope. And now the weight of that choice pressed down on him, heavier than her body ever had. The cabin creaked in the wind. Beyond the walls, the prairie stretched silent, waiting. Jed stared at Mara, his shame boiling with fear. But beneath it, something else began to stir. Something dangerous. Something alive. The crowd's footsteps faded into the mist, leaving behind only the whistle of prairie wind and the hammer of Jed's heartbeat. He leaned against the door, chest aching, sweat cold on his back. The shame of their words still clung to him, but silence had returned. Heavy, uneasy, almost too still. Then it came. A sound that did not belong to the morning. A low rumble, deep as thunder but closer, vibrating through the soil. Jed's eyes shot wide. He pushed the door open and stepped onto the porch. From the northern woods, the mist rippled like a curtain torn by unseen hands. Out lumbered a shape that made Jed's breath freeze in his lungs. A grizzly. Its shoulders rose higher than the stable roof fur, thick and matted gray with age and streaked with scars. Dew clung to its coat, dripping with each step. Its claws gouged the hard earth, dragging up dirt and stones. The beast's growl rolled across the yard, shaking the boards under Jed's boots. Behind him, voices gasped. Some townsfolk had lingered at the fence line, curious, hungry for more gossip. Now their whispers turned to screams. "God save us, it's come back." Run panic scattered them. Women clutched their skirts and fled. Men shoved one another in blind terror. Children wailed as the crowd dissolved into the fog. In moments, Jed stood alone on the porch, his legs weak, watching the monster stride toward his land. The grizzly tore through the fence as if it were dry straw. Chickens shrieked in terror, scattering feathers across the yard. With a single swipe of its paw, the beast reduced the coop to splinters. Boards flew, birds flapped wildly, their cries sharp as knives in the air. Jed's mouth went dry. He reached instinctively for the revolver at his hip but stopped halfway. What good would 6 old bullets do? Shooting it would only enrage it. He had no rifle, no men at his side. He was nothing but a thin rancher, staring at a nightmare that no one else dared face. The bear roared a sound so violent it rattled Jed's teeth. Horses in the stable screamed, hooves pounding against the walls. Jed's knees bent under the force of the sound, and for a heartbeat he felt ready to collapse. Then the cabin door creaked behind him. Jed spun around. Mara stood in the doorway. Her towering frame filled the porch, shadowed against the dim firelight still burning inside. She watched the chaos with an expression Jed could not read, calm, detached, almost curious. Her voice, low and rasping from the rope burns, cut through the noise. A bear. Jed's stomach lurched. "Stay inside," he barked, fear sharpening his words. "That thing will tear you apart." Mara smirked faintly as though amused by his panic. Her eyes glinted steel. "Cain wanted me dead. Looks like the heavens had something more dramatic in mind." And with that, she stepped off the porch. Jed's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to grab her to pull her back inside, but his legs refused to move. All he could do was clutch the railing, watching her stride barefoot across the broken earth. The grizzly turned, nostrils flaring at her scent. It rose on its hind legs, a tower of muscle and fur, casting its massive shadow over the yard. Its roar shook the valley, a declaration of dominance, a promise of death. Mara did not flinch. Her feet pressed firmly into the soil. With each deliberate step, shoulders squared, gaze locked onto the beast, as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. Jed's hands shook so violently, he nearly dropped his revolver. To him, the sight was madness. A woman who had barely survived the noose, now walking unarmed into battle with a monster that could crush her in one blow. "Run," Jed screamed from the porch, voice breaking. "For God's sake, run." But Mara only bent down her hand, closing around a half-burned torch lying in the dirt near the wrecked fence. She lifted it high. The flames flared, sparks bursting into the wind. The bear roared again, paw crashing down, shattering a fence post into jagged shards. Dust and splinters flew. Mara stood her ground. Her voice carried low, steady, clear as a drumbeat. "Come on, big boy." The world held its breath. The grizzly charged. The earth shook under its weight, claws digging trenches in the soil. Dust rose in thick clouds, blinding Jed's eyes. He raised his revolver, finger trembling, but he knew the shot was useless. His heart slammed against his ribs as he watched the impossible unfold. Mara hurled the burning torch straight into the bear's face. Flames exploded in front of its eyes, forcing the beast to rear back in surprise. It bellowed in fury, swiping wildly at the fire. And in that instant, Mara lunged forward. No scream, no war cry, just raw, silent strength. Her entire body slammed into the beast's shoulder. The impact cracked like thunder. The grizzly stumbled backward, claws tearing at the ground as it fought to regain balance. Mara pressed forward, driving it step by step toward the shattered fence. The beast roared, clawing at her. Blood streaked her arms, where its talons grazed skin. But she did not relent. Her muscles corded like iron, her face locked in cold determination. Jed's jaw hung open. He had seen men break in two from a bear's swipe, but Mara, this woman they had called a monster, was matching the creature blow for blow. At the edge of the yard, the grizzly faltered. It stumbled through the broken fence, then turned with a final roar, before retreating into the woods, leaving gouged tracks deep in the soil. Silence fell heavy and unreal. Mara stood alone in the yard, chest, heaving, arms streaked with blood, but her expression was indifferent, as if she had done nothing more than finish a morning chore. Jed sagged against the porch rail, trembling, unable to process what his eyes had just seen. From a distance, townsfolk who had fled earlier now peeked from the mist, their whispers carried on the wind. She stood against it with her bare hands, big as the bear itself. No man lifted a finger. Not one. Jed's shame burned hotter than ever, but beneath it was something new, something terrifying and awe-striking. He no longer saw a woman dragged from the gallows. He saw a force of nature unstoppable, untamed. And in that moment he knew the world around them would never be the same. The yard still reeked of blood and smoke from the torch. The grizzly's tracks carved deep scars into the earth, proof of the impossible battle everyone had just witnessed. Jed leaned against the porch rail, his legs trembling, still trying to steady his breath. Across the field, townsfolk lingered in the mist, whispering of what they had seen. Some eyes held awe, others fear. Mara's towering figure, streaked with blood, yet unbowed, had shaken every soul in Dust Hollow. But not everyone fled. Word traveled faster than wildfire on the prairie, and Cain listened to the wind. By late afternoon, the sound of hooves rolled like thunder down the dirt road. Jed's head snapped up. Dust rose in the distance, a cloud thick and angry. He knew that sound. His stomach knotted before the riders even came into view. Cain arrived in full spectacle. At the head rode the mayor himself, astride a massive black stallion, his white hat gleaming in the fading sun, like a crown of false purity. 24 hired guns flanked him, men hardened by blood, their eyes flat and cold. Behind them, villagers gathered in hushed dread, peeking from behind fences and broken shutters. The town had been summoned to witness. Cain reined in his horse at the broken gate boots, polished voice sharp as a blade. Colton, his words carried across the yard with the authority of a death sentence. Hand over the woman, now, or by sundown this gate will be your gallows. Jed froze, throat dry, palms slick with sweat. The words carved on his post echoed back at him. This is what happens to those who defy Cain's law. His knees threatened to buckle. Then Mara stepped forward. She filled the porch like a storm, shoulders squared, rope burns still raw on her neck. In her hand, she carried the very noose that had nearly killed her, the fibers stiff with dried blood. She placed it into Jed's trembling palm. Her voice, low and steady, brushed his ear. You cut it once. Now we live together or die together. Jed's heart pounded so hard he thought his chest might split. His entire life he had been small, silent, dismissed. But now her words burned through him like fire. He lifted his chin, meeting Cain's glare. She's not going anywhere, Jed said, voice hoarse but firm. If you want blood, Cain, you'll have to step over my body first. A murmur rippled through the crowd. For the first time, the weak rancher, who had always lowered his head, was standing tall. Cain's jaw tightened, fury flashing behind his polished smile. He gave a sharp nod. Gunfire erupted. The yard exploded in chaos, smoke, dust, hooves pounding. Jed dove from the porch, his revolver barking in his hand. The first bullet struck a hired gun in the shoulder, spinning him to the dirt. Jed's hands shook, but his finger no longer hesitated on the trigger. Each shot came faster, sharper, his fear burning away in the roar of battle. Mara moved like a storm unleashed. She swung her massive arm, knocking a gunman clear off his horse. Another rushed at her with pistol drawn. She caught his wrist mid-shot, twisted, and sent him crashing into the ground. Her presence was not human, it was elemental, a force that no man could match. Jed and Mara fought back to back, their movements raw but united. He fired. She struck. Dust and smoke swallowed the yard, but together they carved a path through Cain's men. The same townsfolk who had called Jed weak now watched wide-eyed as he stood unbroken, his frail body fueled by something greater than fear. The tide turned. One by one, Cain's hired guns fell, groaning in the dirt or fleeing into the mist. The once unstoppable army lay broken in the dust at Jed Colton's gate. Then Cain himself was thrown from his stallion. He hit the ground with a grunt, scrambling to his knees, his polished coat smeared with dirt. For the first time, the white-hatted mare looked small. Mara advanced, blood streaked across her arms, rope clutched in her fist. She loomed over him, shadow swallowing the trembling man who had once ruled through fear. Her hands tightened on the noose. For a heartbeat, it seemed she might return the favor, string him up beneath the same words carved into Jed's post. Cain's eyes widened in terror. Wait, don't! But Mara stopped. Her chest rose and fell in steady rhythm. She dropped the rope at his feet. Her voice rang out like a bell, raw and unflinching. This rope once killed me. Today it shows the coward you truly are. The yard fell silent. Jed stepped forward, revolver still smoking, voice shaking but loud enough for all the villagers to hear. "This is the man who hanged an innocent woman at my gate for show. This is the man who's fed off our fear and blood." The crowd stirred. Whispers swelled into words, words into shouts. For the first time the town did not bow its head before Cain. Years of silence cracked like dry timber. Men and women surged forward, stripping Cain of his hat, dragging him to the dirt. The white crown of power crumbled in the dust. Jed stood shoulder to shoulder with Mara, breath-ragged body trembling, but his eyes burned with fire. Together they had done what no one dared face: the beast in the woods and the tyrant in town. The villagers' fear had broken, and in its place something new began to rise. Smoke still hung in the air long after the gunfire faded. The ground at Jed Colton's gate was scarred, with hoofprints, bloodstains, and the shattered pride of Cain's men. Horses limped away, riderless guns lay abandoned in the dust, and the mayor himself had been dragged off by the very people he once ruled with iron law. Jed stood in the yard, chest-heaving revolver, still warm in his trembling hand. Beside him, Mara's towering frame was streaked with dirt and blood, her breath steady despite the storm they had endured. For a moment, silence pressed heavy, broken only by the wind whistling through the broken boards of the fence. It was over. And yet in Jed's chest the battle still thundered. The townsfolk who had once hissed curses at his name did not turn away this time. One by one they approached the gate. First a woman with gray hair tucked under her shawl, clutching a basket of bandages. Then a man with tools slung across his shoulder. Another carried seed sacks. They came not to mock, but to help, their eyes flicking between Jed and Mara with something he had never seen before: respect. Jed felt his throat tighten. He wanted to speak, but words failed. His entire life, he had been the town's weak shadow, the butt of cruel laughter. Now those same voices asked softly, "What can we do?" Mara's gaze swept over them, unreadable, but she gave a faint nod. That was all it took. The spell of fear that Cain had woven over Dust Hollow had snapped for good. In the days that followed, the ranch transformed. Where the grizzly had torn through the yard, neighbors helped raise new fences. Posts sunk deep and straight this time. Men who once jeered at Jed swung hammers beside him, while women patched the roof and brought food to the table. Children trailed behind Mara, wide-eyed, watching her mend broken beams with hands as steady as stone. Jed worked too, his thin frame bent but determined. His calloused palms blistered on the shovel, his back screamed under the weight of lifted timber, but he pushed through. For the first time, when others looked his way, they didn't see frailty, they saw grit. And at the heart of it all was Mara. By her hand, the barn rose again, beams locked tight, as if carved from mountains. By her strength, the soil turned and took seed. And yet, for all her power, Jed noticed the quiet moments, the way she lingered at dusk, staring at the horizon, fingers brushing the scar still burned into her throat. The way her laughter never came, though sometimes her eyes softened when they landed on him. One evening, as the sun spilled gold across the prairie, Jed hammered the last nail into the porch. He turned to see Mara standing by the gate. In her hand, she held the noose. The rope was frayed stiff with old blood, its loop forever bent. For a long moment she stared at it, her jaw set. Jed approached, wiping sweat from his brow. "Best to burn it," he muttered. The sight still made his stomach churn. But Mara shook her head. Without a word, she looped it over a nail on the porch wall. It dangled there, swaying gently in the evening breeze. Jed frowned. Why keep it? Her eyes met his hard as steel, but carrying a depth that made his chest ache. "Not to remember fear," she said. "To remind us we survived it." Jed's throat tightened. He glanced at the rope, then back at her. For the first time he saw more than unbreakable strength in those eyes. He saw warmth, fragile, rare but real. The days bled into weeks. Grass pushed green through the trampled soil, crops sprouted where dust had ruled. The sound of hammers gave way to laughter, faint but growing. Jed and Mara shared the quiet work of living, mending fences, tending animals, planting seeds side by side. Their bodies bore scars, but their silence was no longer heavy with loneliness. One afternoon, Jed paused from the fields and looked toward the gate. The image struck him like a memory twisted into something new. Where once he had found terror, a woman's body swaying lifeless under Cain's law, now he saw strength. The gate no longer marked his shame. It marked his defiance, his choice to cut the rope. Mara joined him, brushing dirt from her hands, her presence towering beside him. She looked at the same gate, her face unreadable. Then slowly she placed her broad hand on his shoulder. For Jed, it was more than comfort. It was proof. Proof that two souls cast out by the world could stand together and make something worth keeping. The prairie wind swept through the grass, carrying with it the faint echo of hoofbeats from long ago. Jed lifted his gaze to the horizon, the sun painting the sky red and gold. For the first time in his life, the sight didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a promise, because real strength wasn't muscle or gunpowder or the fear Cain once commanded. Real strength was what remained when the world tried to break you and failed. The noose swayed lightly on the porch wall, no longer a mark of death, but a symbol of survival. The ranch, once silent as a grave, now pulsed with life. Jed and Mara stood together, not as outcasts, not as freaks, not as weak or monstrous, but as survivors. And in that shared survival, they had become something stronger than Cain's law, stronger than fear itself. Out on the prairie, silence returned. But it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence after a storm, the kind that lets seeds take root. Jed and Mara stood at the gate, the noose swaying gently in the breeze. No longer a mark of death, but of survival. The land would heal, and so would they. Two souls the world had cast aside had found each other, and in their defiance, a town had remembered its courage. Strength was not what Cain claimed it was, standing together. When the world wanted you broken,